Still on the Arise TV Kpmg 2023 Budget Day Summit held yesterday in Lagos. We took an in-depth look in the New Year appropriations and how the components will impact sectors and the Nigerian citizens. Here's the next step of our discussion focusing on infrastructure, the parameters of the new budget, and key issues around its delivery in the election year.
What our analysis suggests is that, but even factoring in all of that, you still come in under $10 billion. Now, coming to your point, that $10 billion or less is still far inadequate compared to our needs as a country. The government has laid out an integrated infrastructure master plan that says essentially that to be able to make a dent on that infrastructure deficit, we need to be able to mobilize in excess of $100 billion on an annual basis.
And you know, the mobilization is what I was going to come to, because the structuring of these projects and the need to crowd in private finance is going to be key. So I want to ask you, are there models of the ideal project that has taken place in Nigeria that serves as a benchmark for how infrastructure projects should be funded or structured?
Maybe this is the point at which, we can start getting into solutioning in terms of what do we need to do going forward to be able to, achieve more success, in this space. By the way, when this government came into power, our infrastructure stock as a percentage of GDP was at about 20%. Through the interventions and the focus that the government has put on infrastructure today, we're sitting on about 35% of GDP, which is significant progress within 8 years. However, as we said, the gap is still huge. So what do we need to do going forward? I think the first, is that we need to sustain and deepen the things we are doing.
So what are we talking about? Sovereign guarantees, enhancements, or what will help unlock that financing?
Those are more tactical issues. I think that the things we need to do are more macro to be able to mobilize, further investment, private investment, into this space. For example, we talk about enabling the environment for the private sector to invest more in infrastructure going forward. One of the things we need to do is to enhance, the legislative framework. We have had an ICRC law for many years now. That law has been revised, taking into account our experience as a country. It's still sitting in Parliament, for example. That law needs to be passed, without delay, because it gives potential investors certainty, in terms of our policy environment, in terms of our legislative environment. Now, coming to issues around guarantees and stuff like that, those will come under the purview of what we call, project preparation or project development. Remember that not all infrastructure projects are suited to private sector investment. So there is a significant upfront work that the government, needs to do to be able to identify, prioritize, and select the right candidate projects for the private sector to come in.
So it's going to be
a partnership. And you need to invest in capacity as a government to be able to do that.
Great, fantastic conversation. Thanks for touching on those points around regulation and enabling the business environment. The conversation continues, and I'm now going to head back to Rotas to continue the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rolake. I really appreciate that very, very in-depth conversation there on the very important infrastructure. Now we go to another big conversation here, of course, on the macroeconomic analysis of the budget as far as the macroeconomy is concerned. Mr. Ajayi, why don't you take us through, I guess, the metrics that we'll be looking at as far as the budget is concerned and the macroeconomy?
So let me start, with the oil production in terms of volume, right? We've said we're going to do 1.69 million barrels per day. And I think the question people are asking, especially, from where we're coming from, in December we produced about 1.2 million barrels of oil per day. And the question is, how realistic, is that number? I think for us to know, oil, just like any other product, is driven by supply and demand factors. And there are several factors that will drive demand and that will drive supply. One factor, of course, is what's going to happen in China, especially with the resurgence of COVID. Will China continue its policy on no zero COVID? of course, they've abandoned that policy, but we don't know what is going to happen. And of course, the other issue is what's going to happen in Ukraine, the Russian war. How long is it going to last for? And of course, the issue of OPEC reaction to all these issues. And maybe the fourth thing that I've talked about might be, are we going to have a buyer cartel? It will be interesting to see what the DG, think about that, or Dr. Tariba think about that. So when you look at those factors, I think the word out there is that the oil market, the global oil market is in deficit. So we'll expect that there might be a reduction in supply, but it will not be enough, for OPEC to change, its production per day. So I think looking at that from that perspective, that number is reasonable. When you come to Nigeria, and I think when you look at the current efforts that the government has done in terms of dealing with the issue of oil theft and security matters, and our production has gone up to 1.3. Yes, we're still below OPEC quota of 1.8 million barrels per day. But at least what we can see is that things, are looking up, and the oil companies now feel confident to inject more oil, into the terminals, onto the pipelines. So I think, the verdict is that the 1.69 million is actually reasonable.
The budget looks to me to be rather optimistic. Okay. Let me put it like that. Yeah. To expect revenue, last year, 2022, revenue increased by 1 trillion, from 6 trillion in 2021 to 7 trillion in 2022. 7 trillion is the peak revenue performance of this administration in 8 years. As a matter of Nigeria's peak revenue in history, in Naira terms. Not to mention the fact that if you correct that 7 trillion for devaluation, it's probably less, much less than the 4 trillion, 5 trillion that we were doing. So to tell me that revenue is going to go from 7 trillion to 10.5 trillion before the end of this year, looks to me, that's something that, I mean, is this realistic? Right. The second is the biggest component of spending is not personnel cost, is interest payment.
Debt servicing.
Yes, debt service. So last year, of the 7 trillion revenue, we paid 6 trillion on interest payment. And so of the 14 trillion that we spent overall, 6 trillion out of it went on debt. Only 8 trillion was left for any other type of spending, which is recurrent capital. And so we borrowed 7 trillion and added it to the 1 trillion left in revenue after we paid debt. So the suggestion, the budget for this year for debt cost only marks that 6 trillion up by 0.39 trillion. So we paid 6 trillion last year. I'm reading in this budget that we budgeted to pay 6.39 trillion. And I said, how can that be? Even if the overall budget stood at 44 trillion, that it was at the end of September, global interest rates this year, domestic interest rates this year will be much higher than last year. So you should expect that even on 44 trillion, you will pay more than 6 trillion in interest. But we are told 10 trillion is going to be issued to finance this year's deficit. Another 22 trillion is going to be issued by securitizing of ways and means. So we are told the debt will move from 44 trillion to 77 trillion by May. Right. Now, so that's a 75% increase in the budget stock. So if you paid 6 trillion or 44 trillion, minimum is to mark up that 6 trillion by 75% of 6 trillion. So you are paying, that's 4.5. So you are paying 10.5 on interest payment. And that takes all the 10.5 we are expecting on revenue. I have my doubts that we can raise revenue of 10.5. I'll be more likely to say we could do 8 trillion. But now, debt cost looks clearly likely to be more than that 8 trillion, likely to take away the entire revenue. So whatever money we'll be spending next year, all must be borrowed.
Very, very in-depth discussion there from the Arise TV KPMG Budget Day.